She rode 1,500 miles across the frontier with a secret tucked against her chest, a secret that breathed and cried and needed feeding every few hours. When Eliza Bennett stepped down from that wagon in the freezing Montana wind, she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was asking for work. But the moment Caleb Mercer saw the infant in her arms, his jaw went tight, his eyes went cold, and he said 4 words she'd been dreading the entire journey. "You lied to me." The storm was already coming, and neither of them knew it would save them both. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Hit like and stay with us until the very end. The wagon rolled into the yard at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the light was already dying. That was the first thing Eliza noticed, how fast the dark came in Montana. Back in St. Louis, the sun at least had the decency to linger, to drag itself down slow behind the rooftops, and give a person time to get their bearings. Out here, it just dropped. One moment the sky was pale and silver. The next, it was the color of a bruise spreading from the mountains, purple and blue and wrong. She had been watching that sky for the past 2 hours, trying not to think about how hungry she was, trying not to think about the letter folded in her coat pocket. The letter she'd written 3 weeks ago, signed with a name and a description that was technically accurate and technically incomplete, in the particular way that all desperate people learn to be incomplete. Experienced cook, hardworking, reliable, accustomed to frontier conditions, available immediately. Every word was true. She just hadn't mentioned Rose. The wagon driver, a weathered man named Pete Galloway, who had barely said 20 words in 2 days of travel, pulled the horses to a stop in front of a low wooden fence and cleared his throat. "Mercer Ranch," he said, as if she couldn't read the hand-painted sign nailed to the post, as if she needed a man to announce her destination to her. "Thank you," she said anyway, because that's what you said when someone had hauled you and your belongings and your infant daughter across 60 miles of frozen dirt road for the price of a meal and 2 bits. She climbed down carefully, Rose tucked against her left side, one hand gripping the wagon frame. The baby stirred but didn't wake. 6 weeks old and already accustomed to motion, to cold, to the smell of a world that hadn't been kind to either of them. Eliza had to give her that much. Rose was not a complaining baby. She seemed to understand, in whatever instinctive way infants understand things, that complaining wouldn't help. Eliza stood in the yard and looked at the ranch. It was larger than she'd expected. The main house was solid, 2 stories of raw timber with a covered porch running the full length of the front. The kind of construction that said this was built to last rather than this was built to look good. To the left, a long bunkhouse with smoke rising from a metal chimney. Beyond that, a barn that could have housed a small church congregation and several outbuildings she couldn't identify in the fading light. The whole property was surrounded by open land that stretched in every direction until it hit the mountains. And the mountains didn't look friendly. They looked like they were waiting for something. She heard men's voices from somewhere behind the barn, a horse blowing out its breath, the distant complaint of cattle. Nobody came to greet her. Pete Galloway had already started turning his wagon around. She grabbed her trunk, a battered leather thing that had survived 3 moves in 2 years, and dragged it toward the porch steps. The trunk weighed more than it should. Everything she owned weighed more than it should, because some of it was Rose's, and babies required an outrageous amount of equipment for such small people. She made it up the porch steps without dropping anything, which she counted as a victory. She knocked on the door. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. Footsteps. Heavy, unhurried footsteps that told her, even before the door opened, something about the man on the other side. A man who didn't rush. A man who had decided somewhere along the way that things could wait for him, because he wasn't waiting for them. The door opened. Caleb Mercer was taller than she'd pictured. She'd built a version of him in her head over the weeks she'd been traveling. A rancher who needed a cook, probably middle-aged, probably practical, probably decent enough to honor a work agreement if she proved herself useful. The man standing in the doorway was maybe 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of cold creek water that were currently fixed on her face with an expression that wasn't quite a frown and wasn't quite anything else. He was wearing a canvas coat over a flannel shirt, and he smelled like horses and wood smoke. And for one brief, stupid moment, Eliza thought, this is going to be fine. Then his gaze dropped. She felt it happen. Felt the exact second his eyes found Rose bundled against her chest in the wool blanket, and she watched the expression on his face change. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, with a gasp or a step backward. It was more like watching a door close quietly. One moment his face was neutral, reading her, making calculations. The next moment it was shut. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Mr. Mercer." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this. "I know this isn't what you were expecting." "No," he said. "It's not." He didn't move out of the doorway. Didn't invite her in. Just stood there in the warm light spilling from behind him, looking at her and at Rose, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working. "I can explain. I advertised for a cook," he said. "A cook who could start immediately, work through winter, handle a full bunkhouse. I asked for someone with experience. I asked for someone reliable. I did not ask for—" He stopped, looked at the baby again. "How old is that child?" 6 weeks. Something moved across his face. Not softness. Something more complicated than that. 6 weeks, he repeated. "She doesn't cry much. She's a good baby. She won't interfere with—" "Miss Bennett." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "This is a working cattle ranch. I've got 14 men in that bunkhouse who need feeding 3 times a day. I've got winter coming in hard and fast, and I need a cook who can manage a kitchen that size without distraction. Not a—" He stopped again, seemed to be choosing his words with some care. "I'm sorry for whatever situation you're in, but I can't use you here. I'll pay for your fare back to—" "There's nowhere to go back to," she said. She hadn't planned to say it like that. She'd planned to be calm, logical, to make her case methodically, the way her mother had taught her, the way that women who wanted to be taken seriously by men had to present things, not with feeling, but with facts. She'd had a whole speech prepared. But standing there in the cold with her feet aching and her arms tired from holding Rose for hours and her stomach so empty it had stopped making noise about it, the words just came out flat and true. "There's nowhere to go back to," she said again. "I have $8.40. The next town is 60 miles east. If you send me back, I'll be stranded at the livery in Denton with a 6-week-old baby and nothing to my name. So I'm asking you, I'm not begging, I'm asking, to give me 1 week. 1 week to prove that I can do this job the way it needs doing. If after a week you don't think I'm worth keeping on, I'll leave without argument." He looked at her for a long moment. The baby chose that particular moment to wake up and make a small, irritable noise against Eliza's shoulder. Not a cry exactly, more of a signal, a preliminary announcement that a cry was available if required. Eliza shifted her automatically, and Rose subsided. Caleb Mercer's eyes moved from the baby to Eliza's face and back to the baby. "Where's the father?" he asked. It wasn't a kind question, but it wasn't a cruel one either. It was the question of a practical man trying to understand a situation. "Gone," she said. "Before she was born." He nodded slowly. Not with sympathy, not with judgment, just absorbing the information, filing it somewhere. "You cooked professionally?" he asked. "Harvey House in Kansas City for 2 years. Before that, my family ran a boarding house. I've been cooking for groups since I was 12. Another pause. She could hear wind coming down from the mountains. Somewhere behind her, a gate banged against a fence post. "You'd need to keep her out of the kitchen when the stove's hot," he said finally. Something loosened in her chest. "Of course," she said, "and she doesn't interfere with meal times. I've got men who wake up at 4:30 and want food. If she's up all night crying, that's not something I can—" "She sleeps," Eliza said. "She's a good sleeper." This was, she would later admit to herself, something of an exaggeration. Rose was adequate sleeper, which is a different thing. But she was also a baby who could be managed, and Eliza had been managing things alone for 6 weeks, which meant she'd developed a particular skill set. Caleb Mercer stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen. We can talk about terms." Eliza picked up her trunk and walked through the door. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, separated from the dining room by a pair of swinging doors. And it was the most beautiful kitchen Eliza had seen in 2 years. She understood that this was a low bar. She'd been living in a single room in St. Louis, cooking on a shared stove in a boarding house hallway. Before that, she'd been in a worse room in a worse boarding house in Topeka, making decisions she's proud of about men who turned out to be exactly what they seemed to be. So her standard for beautiful was not high. But by any measure, this kitchen was well equipped. A cast iron range with 6 burners and a warming oven big enough to handle serious volume. A work table in the center, scarred from years of use but solid. Open shelving lined one wall stocked with supplies: flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, canned goods. A cold pantry off the back, accessible through a low door. A water pump at the sink. 2 windows facing east. Previous cook left in September, Caleb said, standing in the doorway between kitchen and dining room while Eliza walked the space, touching things, taking inventory. She had family trouble and went back to Oregon. I've been feeding the men myself since then, it hasn't been good. What have you been making? He hesitated. Beans, salt pork, biscuits when I have time. She turned to look at him. For 14 men, every day. Mostly. How long? 6 weeks. 6 weeks of salt pork and beans. She could see it, actually, now that she was looking. The way he was holding himself. The particular tiredness around his eyes that wasn't just the end of a long day, but the accumulation of something. A man who'd been doing too many things for too long and not sleeping enough. What time is supper? She asked. 6 o'clock. She glanced at the clock on the shelf above the stove. It was 4:45. Is there beef? She asked. In the smokehouse. Potatoes? Cellar. Onions. He pointed to a barrel in the corner. All right, she said. She set Rose down in the carry basket she'd brought, wedging it carefully against the base of the work table where it couldn't be kicked and the baby couldn't roll anywhere. Rose looked up at the ceiling with the focused, slightly puzzled expression she wore when processing new environments. Can I use what I need? That's what it's there for, he said. She tied on her apron, an old one, stained and soft, that had belonged to her mother, and got to work. She didn't have time to do anything fancy. An hour and 15 minutes was enough for a good beef stew if you moved quickly and didn't waste motion, enough for a double batch of biscuits, enough to stew down some dried apples with cinnamon if you got them started first. She worked fast and without fussing, making decisions on the fly, keeping one eye on Rose, one ear on the sound of the wind picking up outside. Caleb Mercer disappeared somewhere during the first 20 minutes, which she took as either a good sign or a neutral one. He wasn't hovering. She could work without being watched. The men came in at 6 o'clock like a tide, 14 of them, tracking mud and cold air, loud and particular the way men who'd been outside all day in the cold were always particular. They settled into benches on both sides of the long trestle table in the dining room, and they went quiet when Eliza came through the swinging doors carrying the first pot. She'd noticed on her way through that they'd gone quiet. Not a polite quiet, a surprised quiet. They'd been expecting Caleb's salt pork and beans, and instead there was beef stew with potatoes and onions and biscuits stacked in a cloth-lined basket, and stewed apples in a pot on the side. A man at the far end of the table said, "Lord have mercy." It wasn't a complaint. She set down the pot and went back for the biscuits and the apples and the coffee she'd started 20 minutes ago. When she came back through, the men were already serving themselves, and the sound in the room had shifted from tired silence to something warmer and more animated. Somebody laughed. Somebody else said something she didn't catch, and 3 more men laughed. She stood at the edge of the room with her coffee pot and watched Caleb Mercer pour himself a bowl of stew and eat a biscuit and drink his coffee. And she watched his face during all of this, and she saw the exact moment he tasted the stew. He didn't say anything. He just ate. But there was something in the way he set down his spoon, picked up his coffee cup, and looked at the wall opposite him, not looking at anything, just sitting with a thought, that told her something had shifted. She refilled coffee cups. She went back to the kitchen to clean up. She fed Rose, who had stayed quiet through the whole meal like a small, cooperative miracle. Later, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, Caleb Mercer came to the kitchen door. He stood there for a moment, watching her wash the last of the pots. "The men want to know your name," he said. "They can call me Eliza, or Miss Bennett, if they prefer." He nodded. "All right." He started to turn away. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me in." He didn't answer that, just gave a short nod. the kind that didn't commit to anything, and walked down the hall toward what she assumed was his study or his bedroom or wherever a man like that went when the day was done. She finished the dishes. Outside, the wind was doing something that felt like a warning. She had been at the ranch for 4 days when the trouble started. Not big trouble. Ranch trouble. The kind that happened constantly in the background of a working cattle operation. The kind that could spiral into something worse if the wrong people handled it badly. The problem was a man named Dolan. Walt Dolan was the oldest hand on the ranch, somewhere in his late 40s or early 50s, with a face like weathered saddle leather and opinions about the proper order of things that he'd formed somewhere around 1865 and had not revisited since. He hadn't said anything directly rude to Eliza in her first few days. He hadn't said much to her at all, but she felt him watching her at mealtimes with the particular intensity of a man building a case. It came out on the 4th day, at lunch. She'd made salt pork, after all, a proper version, with white beans and a pan of cornbread and some pickled beets she'd found in the back of the pantry. The men were eating well, and the kitchen had developed a rhythm she recognized from her time at the Harvey house, a comfortable, efficient hum where everything moved in the right order and the timing worked out. She'd just come back from refilling the breadbasket when she heard Dolan's voice from the far end of the table, loud enough to be meant for everyone. "Don't see why she needs to bring that baby in here," he said. "Makes the whole place smell like milk and whatnot. This is a working ranch, not a nursery." The table went quiet. Rose was in her basket near the kitchen door, visible but not intrusive, doing what she mostly did during mealtimes, which was sleep or look at things. She was not crying. She was not, to any reasonable standard, causing difficulty. Eliza set the breadbasket down on the table. She kept her hands very steady. "The baby stays where I can see her," she said. "She's not in anyone's way." "Maybe not," Dolan said, still loud, performing for the room. "But it ain't appropriate. Place like this, doing the work we're doing, we don't need—" "Walt." Caleb's voice came from the head of the table. Not loud, not aggressive, just flat and final, the way certain men could make their voices when they wanted something to stop. Dolan looked at him. "She stays," Caleb said. "The baby stays. You got a problem with the arrangement? You can eat later, after everyone else is done." Dolan's jaw moved like he was chewing something tough. He looked at Eliza, he looked at Caleb, he looked at the breadbasket. He picked up a piece of cornbread and didn't say anything else. Eliza went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink for a moment, her hands on the edge of the basin, looking at the water. Not crying. She was well past the stage where she cried easily. But there was a tightness in her throat that meant something, and she let herself feel it for about 30 seconds before she let it go and turned back to the stove. The rest of the men ate in a conversation that gradually warmed up again, and nobody talked about babies or appropriate arrangements, and Dolan ate 2 pieces of cornbread. That evening, Caleb knocked on the door of the room she'd been given off the back of the kitchen. A small room, barely big enough for a cot and the trunk and the basket for Rose, but with a good stove vent and thick walls. She'd made it work. You could make a lot of things work if you had to. She opened the door. "Dolan's got a loud mouth," Caleb said. "Don't take it personal. He was like that with the last cook too, and she'd been here 3 years." "It wasn't personal," she said. "I know the type." He looked at her steadily. "Do you?" "Men who need to establish that they were here first," she said, "that they have seniority over any change to the order of things. It's not really about me or Rose, it's about him feeling like something got shifted without his permission." Caleb considered this. "That's a generous interpretation." "Not generous, accurate. If I take it personally, I spend energy being upset. If I take it practically, I just wait him out." She paused. The cornbread helped. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that had the same general address as a smile. "The cornbread helped," he repeated. "Men like Dolan can hold a grievance for a while, but they can't hold it forever if the cornbread's good." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh. It was too brief to be sure. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Bennett," and walked away down the hall. She closed the door. She stood in the small room with Rose asleep in her basket and the wind coming down hard from the mountains, and for a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel something that wasn't quite hope but was in the same neighborhood. A small, cautious warmth. Then she blew out the lamp and lay down on the cot and didn't let herself think too far ahead, because thinking too far ahead was the fastest way she knew to make things fall apart. The storm came on the 7th day. She'd felt it building for 2 days before, a change in the air, a particular stillness that had settled over the mountains like something quicker and more deliberate than usual, bringing equipment inside, covering things, having terse conversations about cattle positions and which pastures to pull the herd from before the weather turned. At breakfast on the morning of the 7th day, there was a tension in the dining room that she could feel the way you feel a shift in barometric pressure. Not see it exactly, but sense it in your skin. "How bad?" she heard one of the younger hands ask another quietly while she was refilling the coffee. "Donovan says maybe 2 feet," the other one said. "Maybe more." 2 feet, the first one repeated and whistled low. She watched Caleb at the head of the table. He was eating methodically, the way he did everything. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Like a man who had learned that panic was a waste of resources. But she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was already somewhere else in his head, running through the logistics of what was coming. She went back to the kitchen. She'd started building toward the storm 3 days ago, without entirely admitting to herself that that was what she was doing. Baking extra bread, making sure the flour barrel was full, checking the cold pantry and the cellar. Now she made a list in her head of what she still needed to do. By the time she'd done breakfast dishes and made a plan for lunch, the sky outside the kitchen windows had gone white. Not gray. White. That particular flat, dense white that meant a storm wasn't coming from the west, but from directly overhead, from the whole sky at once. She went to the back door and opened it. The wind hit her like a wall. She stood there for 3 seconds, getting a measure of it. Then she shut the door and went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, already moving, already giving orders. She stood in the barn door until he looked up. "What do you need?" she asked. "Stay inside," he said. "Keep the stove going. If it gets bad—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider. "It's going to get bad. How many men are with you?" "6. The others are already inside." He was moving while he talked, pulling rope, speaking to the men around him in short, decisive sentences. "We've got cattle in the east pasture that we need to pull before this closes in." "How long?" 2 hours. Maybe more. She looked at the sky through the barn door behind her. She had spent enough winters in Missouri to know what 2 hours might become. "All right," she said. "I'll have food ready when you get back." He looked at her then, and there was something in the look that she didn't entirely know what to do with. Not warm exactly, but direct and specific, like he was actually seeing her rather than just registering her presence. "Be careful with the stove," he said. "Don't let the flue back up." "I've managed stoves in winter before," she said. "I know," he said, and he went back to giving orders. She went back inside. What? She kept the stove hot. She made soup, a big pot of it, beef broth with vegetables and barley, the kind of thing that would stay warm and could be reheated and would do what food needed to do on a bad night, which was to reach into a cold man and remind him he was still alive. The snow started at noon and the wind started at 1, and by 2 o'clock the world outside the kitchen windows had ceased to exist. There was nothing out there but white. Not the pleasant Christmas card white of a moderate snowfall, but a violent battering white that you could hear as much as see, a sound like freight wagons loaded with broken rock being pulled at speed across the sky. The men who'd stayed behind, the other 8, mostly stayed in the bunkhouse, which was their territory. A couple of them came to the kitchen door at different points during the afternoon to check on her, she thought, or maybe just to be near warmth and light and the smell of something cooking. Tom Briggs, who was 23 and had a gap between his front teeth and a way of looking at Rose that made him seem younger than he was, sat at the kitchen table for an hour in the mid-afternoon, not really doing anything. "You think they're okay?" he asked at one point, meaning Caleb and the men in the east pasture. "Caleb Mercer's been running cattle in this country for what, 10 years?" she said. 12. "Then he knows what to do," she said. She believed it, more or less. You had to believe it, because the alternative, the picture she kept having to push out of her mind, of men losing their way in that white nothing outside, wasn't something she could afford to sit with. "Yeah," Tom said. He watched her stir the soup. "Smells real good." "Go back to the bunkhouse," she said. "I'll call you when it's ready." He went, with the mild cooperativeness of someone who was used to being told what to do by women in kitchens, which she appreciated. They came back at 4:30. She heard them before she saw them. A door slamming, voices, the particular commotion of more than one person arriving all at once. The sound of things being knocked over. She was already untying her apron as she pushed through the door into the back hallway. 6 men. They were all there, all of them, and for a second the relief was so sudden it made her slightly dizzy. They were snow-covered and ice-crusted, and their faces were the raw, chapped red of skin that has been scoured by wind. But they were upright, and they were moving, and they were swearing quietly at each other and at the weather, which meant they were fine, mostly fine. Caleb was the last one through the door, and he was walking wrong. Not badly. He wasn't limping exactly, but there was a stiffness to the way he was moving his left side, a deliberateness, like someone moving around a hurt rather than through it. "Kitchen," she said to all of them. "Soup's ready. Go." She let the other 5 file past her. Then she stepped into Caleb's path. "What happened?" she asked. "Horse slipped," he said. "I'm fine." "You're holding your left arm funny." "I said I'm fine." "Take your coat off," she said. He looked at her. "Miss Bennett, take your coat off, Mr. Mercer, or I'll have Tom Briggs take it off for you, and neither of us will enjoy that." A pause. He was still doing that thing where he looked at her as though trying to decide something. Then he started unbuttoning the coat. The shoulder was wrong. She could see it immediately when he got the coat off. A swelling, a heat, the particular way he was holding the arm at his side. Not a break. A bad bruise at minimum, possibly a separation. "Can you raise it?" she asked. He tried. He got it about halfway up before his face did something that wasn't quite a wince. A deliberate, controlled almost wince. The face of a man who had decided years ago that showing pain was a kind of weakness and had stuck to that decision through what was probably a lot of pain. "So that's a no," she said. "It just needs—" "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. The other men were crowded around the stove with their bowls of soup, warming their hands on the sides, talking over each other, doing the post-danger noise of men who'd come through something tight. They were paying attention to each other and to the soup, not to the far end of the table where Caleb sat with his coat off and his arm held carefully against his side. Eliza got a clean cloth from the drawer, dipped it in the hot water she kept on the back of the stove, wrung it out. She pressed it gently against his shoulder. He went very still. "Tell me if that's too hot," she said. "It's fine." She kept the compress there, working slowly, feeling for the shape of the damage through the cloth and the heat. Not a doctor, she knew that. But her father had been a rancher and her brothers had been cowboys, and she'd seen enough shoulder injuries to know the difference between something that needed a doctor immediately and something that needed heat and rest and time. "I think it's a bruise," she said. "Deep tissue. You'll want to keep it warm tonight and rest it tomorrow." "I can't rest it tomorrow," he said. "We've got—" "You can rest it tomorrow," she said. "Or you can use it tomorrow and make it worse and rest it for 3 weeks. Your choice." He looked at her. The kitchen was warm and bright and smelled like beef soup, and the men were talking, and Rose was asleep in her basket in the corner, and the storm was battering the walls outside like it was trying to get in, and Caleb Mercer was sitting very still while she held a warm cloth to his shoulder, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You're very direct," he said. "It saves time. You're also—" He stopped. "I'm also what?" He shook his head slightly. "Nothing." She changed the compress. He ate his soup left-handed, which he did well enough that she thought he'd done it before. Later, when the other men had gone back to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, she made him another bowl of soup and set it in front of him without being asked. He looked at it, then at her. "You don't have to—" he started. "Eat the soup," she said. He ate the soup. She cleaned up around him, and the storm kept going outside. And at some point Rose woke up and made her preliminary announcement noise, and Eliza went to pick her up. When she turned around with the baby on her shoulder, Caleb was watching them with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not soft. He wasn't a soft man, but something had loosened in it, some set thing that had been there since she arrived, and for the first time she could see what was underneath. A loneliness so thorough it had almost become invisible. She didn't say anything about it. You didn't say things about that. You just carried it with you, the knowledge of it, and you moved carefully around it the way you moved carefully around something fragile that had been standing alone in the cold for a long time. "Good night, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Good night," he said. And then, after a pause, "Eliza." It was the first time he'd used her name. She went to her room with Rose and the warm feeling she still refused to call hope, and she lay down in the dark with the storm shaking the walls, and she thought, 7 days. She had made it 7 days. She pressed her cheek against the top of Rose's head and closed her eyes and let herself, just for a moment, not think about tomorrow. Outside, the snow kept falling. The storm lasted 3 days. Not the dramatic, climactic kind of 3 days that stories like to compress into a single turning point, but 3 actual days of grinding, exhausting confinement, windows packed white, doors that required 2 men to push open against the drifts, a cold so complete it got inside the walls and made the timber groan at night like something in pain, the kind of weather that didn't feel cinematic while you were living through it. It just felt long. Eliza kept the stove going around the clock. She slept in 2-hour stretches, getting up to feed Rose, getting up again to check the fire, getting up at 4 in the morning to start biscuits because 14 men still needed breakfast even when the world outside had been replaced by a solid white wall. She was running on less sleep than was probably safe and more coffee than was probably wise, and by the second morning her hands had developed a faint tremor that she noticed only when she was pouring, and she told herself it was the cold and kept moving. She'd learned early on that stopping was the enemy. The moment you stopped moving, your body started filing its complaints. And there were too many of them, and too little she could do about any of them. So it was better to stay in motion. The men were restless in the way that men confined against their will always were, but not quite arguing, not quite at ease, existing in that particular friction of too many people in too small a space with nothing useful to do. She could hear it in the bunkhouse, a low continuous rumble of voices that occasionally spiked into something louder. She could see it at mealtimes in the way they sat too close together and ate too fast and looked toward the windows with a kind of chained irritation. She did what she could. She cooked more food than was strictly necessary, because eating gave people something to do with their hands and their attention, and a man with a full belly was measurably less likely to snap at the man next to him. She kept the coffee coming. She let Tom Briggs sit at the kitchen table in the afternoons and talk at her while she worked, because he was 23 and from Illinois and hadn't been away from his family through a winter before, and he needed somebody to talk to more than he needed to admit that. "My ma used to make this thing with apples and brown sugar," he said on the second afternoon, watching her roll biscuit dough. "Kind of a cake, but not really a cake. More like, I don't know, it was flat cake." "A buckle," she said. "You've got dried apples in the pantry. I'll make it tonight." He looked at her like she'd offered him something more than a dessert. "Yeah?" "Don't thank me yet. Dried apples are not the same as fresh." "Still," he said, "she made the buckle. It wasn't as good as fresh apples. She'd been right about that. But it was warm and sweet, and it smelled like something domestic and familiar, and when she brought it out after supper, the dining room went quiet in a way she was learning to recognize. That particular silence of men who had been reminded, unexpectedly, of somewhere else. Somewhere they'd left. Somewhere they were trying to get back to. Even Dolan ate 2 helpings and didn't say a word about babies or nurseries. Caleb had spent most of the storm's duration moving between the barn and the main house, checking on the horses, doing what could be done with one arm working properly and one arm being carefully favored. She watched him compensate, the way he shifted his weight, used his right side for more than it was built to handle, took twice as long to do things that should have taken half the time. He didn't complain. She hadn't expected him to. But she noticed. On the second night, she left a cloth soaked in liniment outside his door. She didn't knock. She didn't leave a note. She just set it on the floor and went back to her room. In the morning it was gone, and he didn't mention it, and neither did she. That was how most things worked between them, she was figuring out. Not spoken, just done, and acknowledged in that particular quiet way where both people knew and neither person said, and somehow that wordless knowing felt more honest than a lot of conversations she'd had with people who talked all the time. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day. She knew it before she got out of bed. There was a different quality to the silence, a stillness that wasn't the held breath stillness of the storm, but something more settled. She got up and looked out the window, and the sky was the kind of hard, painful blue that only happened after heavy weather, the sun hitting new snow with an intensity that made her squint even from inside. She heard the sound of men moving with purpose again, voices that had purpose in them, the creak of barn doors. The confinement was over and everyone was feeling it. She started breakfast. By the time she'd gotten food on the table and the men had eaten and gone back to the work that 3 days of idleness had backed up, the ranch had a different energy. Purposeful. A little raw, the way you felt after being sick, tender around the edges, but glad to be moving. Caleb came through the kitchen at mid-morning, pulling on his heavy coat. He stopped in the doorway. "Shoulders better," he said. "Not, thank you. Just the information, delivered plainly." "Good," she said. He started to go. Then, "The men are saying the apple thing last night was yours." She kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring. "Tom told me his mother used to make it." A pause. "It was a good idea," he said. Not a compliment to her cooking exactly. Something else. An acknowledgement of the thinking behind it. "They were getting edgy," she said. "Food helps." "Yeah," he said. "It does." And he went out into the cold. She listened to the sound of his boots on the porch steps and told herself that the warmth in her chest was just proximity to the stove. The weeks that followed the storm established a rhythm that settled over the ranch the way snow settled over open ground, quietly, evenly, changing the shape of everything without making a sound about it. She learned the men by their habits. Dolan took his coffee black and too hot, burning his mouth every morning with the same stubbornness, as if he refused to let the temperature tell him what to do. He had stopped making remarks about Rose, but he still watched Eliza sometimes with the wary look of a man who hasn't decided yet whether to trust something new, and she let him watch. She understood by now that the watching was his way of coming around. Tom Briggs wanted seconds of anything involving potatoes. A quiet, compact man named Reeves was the one she had to watch for. He never asked for anything, ate whatever was in front of him without comment, and was therefore the one most likely to go without if she didn't specifically notice him and put a plate in his hands. She learned the kitchen the way you learned a person, its moods, its quirks, the particular way the back left burner ran hot and needed adjusting, the draft that came in under the pantry door when the wind was from the north, the fact that the flour barrel collected moisture at the bottom and needed checking weekly, or the biscuits came out wrong. She learned Caleb Mercer the way she learned all of it, carefully, incrementally, by paying attention to small things. He was up before anyone else, every morning without exception. She'd started rising at 4 to begin breakfast, and even then there were mornings she came into the kitchen and found the stove already tended, the wood box refilled, a fresh pot of water on the heat. He never mentioned having done it. She never mentioned finding it. But the first morning it happened, she stood at the stove for a moment with her hand on the warm iron and felt something complicated move through her. He didn't talk much at meals. Not no talking, just less than most of the men. A quiet presence at the head of the table that was somehow louder than the noise around him because of its stillness. He listened to what the men said. He answered questions directly. He didn't explain himself, and he didn't ask for explanations from others unless he needed specific information. And when he gave an order, it was phrased like a statement of fact rather than a demand, which she'd noticed made the men follow it more readily than if he'd been louder about it. He was hard on himself in ways he didn't seem to notice. She saw it in the hours he kept, up before light, last to come in at night, always the one who stayed to check something twice or do the last task that could technically have waited till morning. She saw it in the way he ate, mechanically and without much apparent interest in the food, as though eating were a maintenance task rather than a pleasure, fuel rather than experience. She started making small adjustments to his plate that she didn't make for anyone else. A slightly larger portion, something extra on the side, coffee that she made a point of refreshing before he'd gotten to the bottom of his cup. She wasn't sure why she did it. She just did it. He noticed. She could tell by the slight pause before he picked up his fork on the mornings when something was different, the fractional stillness of a man registering an unexpected detail. He never said anything about it, and neither did she. Rose was growing. It seemed to Eliza like it happened faster out here than it would have somewhere else, though she knew that was nonsense, though babies grew at the rate they grew, regardless of geography. But there was something about the ranch air, or the routine, or maybe just the fact that for the first time since Rose was born, they weren't in a state of constant crisis, that made the changes seem more visible. The baby was alert now in a way she hadn't been in St. Louis, watching things with wide, serious eyes, tracking movement, making sounds that weren't quite words, but were clearly communicative. She'd started having opinions about the Cowboys. Not bad opinions, mostly. She tolerated Tom Briggs with the equanimity of someone who had made a considered decision, which manifested as occasionally allowing him to hold her hand when he offered it with that nervous, trying to be casual expression he got. She had decided, apparently, that Reeves was acceptable. She would look at him across the dining room with a focus that made the quiet man slightly uncomfortable in a way he clearly didn't know what to do with. And she watched Caleb. Eliza noticed this before Caleb did. That was the thing about watching a man from across a kitchen for several weeks. You saw his patterns before he saw them himself. Rose would track him whenever he came into a room, eyes moving with a steadiness that babies usually reserved for light sources and faces they recognized. When he sat at the far end of the table, she would orient toward him. When his voice came from another room, something in her small body would go still in the listening way, rather than the random stillness of someone who just happened to stop moving. She was 3 days from saying something, she was sure of it. One of those mornings when Caleb came through the kitchen for coffee before anyone else was up, and Rose, in her basket near the stove, did her tracking thing, turning her head toward him with solemn attention. Caleb poured his coffee. He turned around to lean against the counter and he saw Rose watching him. He went still. Not uncomfortable still, just stopped. The way people stopped when something caught them off guard in a way they hadn't prepared a response for. Rose made a sound, a small conversational sound, the kind she made when she was directing remarks at something that had her interest. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who didn't usually do uncertain things, he took 3 steps across the kitchen and crouched down to her basket level. Rose stared at him. He stared back. "Hey," he said. Quietly, without inflection, the same tone he used when he was talking to a horse he wasn't sure about yet. Rose reached out and grabbed his coffee cup holding hand. She had, in the past week, developed a strong interest in grabbing things. She was indiscriminate about it. She grabbed whatever came within range. But Caleb Mercer's large, work-roughened hand apparently met whatever criteria she was applying, and she grabbed it with both of her small ones and held on. Eliza stood at the stove and didn't move and didn't make a sound. Caleb was looking at Rose's hands on his, and his face had done something she'd never seen it do before. It hadn't softened exactly. That wasn't the right word. It had opened, like a door that had been stuck, not locked, and had just been pushed the right way for the first time in a long while. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before Rose lost interest and released him and went back to studying the ceiling, which she also found engrossing. Caleb stood up. He picked up his coffee. He didn't look at Eliza, but she thought he knew she'd been watching. He walked out of the kitchen without saying anything. She let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she'd been holding. November became December, and December hardened around the ranch, like the cold that now lived in everything. The walls, the ground, the air itself, which by early December had a quality that wasn't just cold but dense, as though the temperature had added a physical weight to the atmosphere. Eliza had grown up with Missouri winters, and she'd thought she understood cold. She hadn't understood cold. Montana in December was a different taxonomy entirely. She adapted. You adapted or you didn't get through, and Eliza had never not gotten through something. She started keeping the kitchen warmer. She added a second layer to Rose's sleeping basket. She figured out that the trick with the bunkhouse breakfast was to do the actual cooking 15 minutes earlier than necessary, so the food had time to come back up to full heat after she carried it across the cold yard, because cold scrambled eggs were an insult to everyone involved. The men noticed this without saying so, the same way they'd noticed the gradual improvement in everything since she'd arrived. And Eliza knew they'd noticed because the general quality of conversation at mealtimes had shifted from the grunting functionality of men enduring food to something closer to people actually eating together. They talked more. They argued about things that didn't matter and laughed about things that were only funny because they all shared the same reference points, the same daily world. A bunkhouse had its own culture, and she wasn't part of it, and wasn't trying to be. But she was adjacent to it now, and adjacency was something. Dolan asked her one afternoon in mid-December how she'd learned to make biscuits. He asked it abruptly, in the middle of her working, the way he did most things, direct and a little hostile sounding, even when he wasn't being hostile. Just his manner. She told him. Her mother's kitchen in Ohio, age 8, standing on a stool because she couldn't reach the counter. The way her mother had measured nothing, had just known by feel how much flour, how much lard, how much buttermilk. He listened to this with his arms crossed and his face arranged in skepticism. "My wife made biscuits," he said when she finished. She waited. "Been 8 years," he said. She kept her hands moving in the dough. "I'm sorry," she said. "She had a different way of doing it," he said. "More salt. Some people like more salt." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "She did." He left after that, without any apparent conclusion to the conversation, which she was beginning to understand was just how he operated. He didn't do neat endings. But the next morning he said "morning" to her when he came through the kitchen door, which was the first time he'd addressed her directly and voluntarily in 5 weeks. And she counted that. Christmas came up on her faster than she expected. She'd been moving through time in the frontier way, but not by dates exactly, but by what needed doing and what the weather was and how the light sat in the afternoon. And she didn't think much about the calendar until Tom Briggs mentioned 3 days out that it was almost the 25th. She was quiet for a moment when he said it. Then she went to the pantry and took stock of what she had. She didn't tell anyone what she was planning. She just started the preparations 2 days early, working in the margins of the regular cooking, setting things aside. A dried fruit cake that needed 2 days to set. Preserved wild berries she'd found at the back of the cellar. The last of the sugar reserved for something worth spending it on. Caleb found her in the kitchen at 10 o'clock on Christmas Eve, past when he usually came through. She was rolling out a pie crust with the focused intensity of someone who had decided that a thing was worth doing and was doing it properly. He stopped in the doorway. "What are you making?" "Pie. At 10 at night. It needs to cool overnight." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't mention—" "It's Christmas," she said. "I don't need to mention it." He came in and poured himself the last of the coffee, which was strong and old and not very good by that point in the evening, but he drank it anyway. He sat at the table and didn't leave. She worked, and he sat there, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That was the thing she kept noticing about the silences between them. They had stopped being the silences of two people who didn't know each other and had become something else. The silences of two people who were used to each other's presence and didn't need to fill it. "My wife liked Christmas," he said at some point. She kept working. She hadn't known he'd had a wife. She and our boy used to make, decorations. Cut paper things. She'd hang them everywhere and I always thought it was too much. And then when they were gone, I thought about those paper things more than I'd have expected. His voice was level, informational. The same register he used for talking about cattle prices or fence repair. But under it was something she recognized by its texture. The particular flatness that came from having said something real and braced for it. "How old was he?" she asked. 4? A pause. "Fever. 7 years ago. She went the following spring." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "The ranch was the only thing I knew how to keep." She understood then. Not all of it, but the shape of it. The walls. The careful order. The way he'd reacted when she'd arrived with a baby. The particular tightness of a man encountering something that resembled too closely what he'd lost. She finished the pie crust. She put the pie in the oven. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago," he said. "Doesn't always matter how long ago," she said. He looked at her across the kitchen. Something in his face that she couldn't name was there for a moment, and then he nodded once and stood up. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. She watched him walk out. Then she sat down at the kitchen table because her legs had decided they were done for a moment, and she sat there in the warm kitchen with the pie in the oven and Rose asleep in her basket and the wind coming down from the mountains outside. And she thought about paper decorations hung by a woman she'd never meet, and a small boy who'd had 4 years in the world, and a man who'd built walls tall enough to keep the wind out, and apparently everything else too. She thought about her own walls, which were shorter but served the same purpose. Then she got up and checked on the pie and went to bed. Christmas morning, when the men came in for breakfast, there was a fruitcake on the table and a pie and coffee sweetened for once without rationing, and nobody said anything about it being special or out of the ordinary. They just sat down and ate with the quiet pleasure of people receiving something they hadn't asked for and weren't sure they'd earned, which was perhaps the best way to receive anything. Caleb sat at the head of the table and ate his pie and drank his coffee, and when he looked down the table at her standing at the kitchen door with Rose on her shoulder, his face did the thing it had been doing more often lately. That opening, that fractional unbuttoning. and he held the look for just a second before he looked away. It was enough. Outside, the snow was still falling, the way it had been falling, the way it would keep falling for months more, patient and indifferent and cold. But inside the long trestle table was full, and the food was warm, and the men were talking to each other about nothing that mattered, which meant everything was fine, which in a Montana winter was not a small thing. It was, Eliza thought, a reasonable Christmas. January came in mean. Not the dramatic meanness of the November blizzard, which had at least announced itself with that white sky and that wall of wind. January was meaner in the quiet way. A sustained, grinding cold that didn't peak and break, but just sat on the land like something that had decided to stay. The temperature dropped in the first week and kept dropping, and by the middle of the month, the water in the barn trough was freezing solid overnight and needed to be broken every morning before the horses could drink. And the men who came in for breakfast looked like they'd been fighting something even before the day had properly started. Eliza learned to read the weather by the way Caleb looked at the sky. He did it every morning, stepped off the porch before breakfast, stood in the yard for a minute, looked north and then west. And something in the set of his shoulders when he came back inside told her more than the sky itself. A relaxed set meant a manageable day. A tightened set meant they'd be running short somewhere before dark. And there was a third thing, rarer, that she'd only seen twice before. A stillness, a particular quality of attention, like a man listening for something he hoped he wouldn't hear. She saw it on the morning of January the 14th. She was at the stove when he came back in from his sky reading, and she caught it in her peripheral vision. That stillness, that listening quality. And she turned to look at him directly. He was already looking at the floor, jaw working, running through something in his head. "Problem?" she asked. "Weather's changing," he said. "Fast, from the northwest." He paused. "I've got men out at the north pasture checking fence line. 3 of them. They went out at first light." "How far is the north pasture?" 4 miles, maybe 4.5. She looked at the windows. The sky was still pale and clear, but there was a quality to the light she'd been noticing for the past hour that she hadn't had words for until now. A yellowish cast. A flatness. "How fast does it change?" she asked. "Out here?" He looked at her. "Fast enough." He was already moving to the door, pulling his coat from the hook, calling for Reeves. She heard the bunkhouse door open and shut, heard voices in the yard, heard horses being brought out of the barn with a speed that meant everyone had looked at that same northern sky and drawn the same conclusion. By the time she had coffee and a pair of tin flasks and biscuits wrapped in cloth, Caleb was already mounted. He leaned down from the saddle when she came off the porch and took the flasks without a word, tucked them inside his coat. 6 men with me, he said. "The others stay here." "All right," she said. He looked at her for a second, not long but direct, the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, like he was making sure she was actually there and not something he'd invented. Then he turned the horse, and they rode out. She watched them go. Then she went inside and built the fire up as high as it would take, and started thinking about what a man who'd been out in what was coming would need when he got back. The storm arrived at noon, and it was nothing like November. November's blizzard had been violent and sudden, a single dramatic event. This was something worse. A slow, dense, suffocating thing that came in layers. First a drop in temperature so sharp it made the air feel brittle. Then cloud cover so complete and low it seemed to press down on the rooftops. Then snow that didn't fall so much as materialize, as if the air itself were turning solid. And under all of it, a wind from the northwest that wasn't gusting but constant. A steady pressure that you could hear in the walls as a low, continuous note, like something tuning itself for a long performance. Tom Briggs came to the kitchen door at 1 o'clock, snow already collecting on his hat. "Mr. Mercer's not back," he said. "I know," she said. "Should have been back by now." "I know," she said again. She kept her voice even. Tom was young enough that if she let him see her worry, his would expand to fill whatever space she gave it, and then he'd be useless. "Put more wood on the bunkhouse fire. Make sure the barn's shut tight. Keep everyone inside." He looked at her for a moment, seemed to be deciding whether she had the authority to give him these instructions. Then he nodded and went. She went to the kitchen window that faced north and stood there and watched the white nothing where the north pasture was, 4.5 miles away. The early afternoon was the worst period, not because anything happened, but because nothing happened. The storm got worse, and the clock moved, and there was no sound from outside except wind and more wind, and she had 8 men's worth of anxiety to manage in addition to her own. And Rose, who could apparently feel the barometric shift in human emotion in the room, the same way she felt actual barometric shifts, was fussier than usual and required carrying. So she carried her. And she cooked. She made the biggest pot of beef broth she could manage, and she put cornbread on, and she made a second pot of coffee that she kept at a slow simmer rather than a full boil so it wouldn't turn bitter. She moved around the kitchen with Rose on one arm and a spoon in the other hand, and she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself since she was 19 years old, and things were bad. One thing at a time. Just the next thing. At 3:30, Reeves put his head in from the back door. Reeves, who was quiet as a held breath on a normal day, had snow in his eyebrows and an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite getting there. "I think I hear them," he said. She was at the back door before he'd finished the sentence. She stood on the back step and listened. Wind, more wind, and then, under it, something, horses and voices, the specific kind of voices that people used when they were directing each other through difficulty. "Get Tom and whoever else is available," she said. "Go help bring them in." She went back to the stove. She heard them before she saw them. The back door opening, multiple people at once, the commotion of bodies that had been through something coming inside. She didn't go out. She stayed at the stove and kept the broth hot and the cornbread warm and waited, because what they needed first was heat and food, and she could provide those, and running into the hallway to count heads would only be in the way. Tom came through the kitchen door first. He was white-faced. "Everyone's in," he said. "But—" He stopped. "But what?" she said. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped again. "He's—" She moved him out of the doorway with a hand on his arm and went into the back hallway. They had Caleb on his feet, which was something, but he wasn't standing under his own power the way he should have been. Reeves had one of his arms over his shoulder, and a younger hand named Curtis had the other. And Caleb was upright, but with the particular upright of someone whose legs were doing a creditable job of pretending to work. His coat was sheeted with ice. His face was the wrong color, not the raw red of someone who'd been in the cold and come back. A grayer color. A worrying color. "What happened?" she asked, addressing the room in general. "Horse went down," Reeves said. He was getting Caleb's coat off as he talked, working around the problem of Caleb's limited cooperation. "Ice under the snow. We were almost back, maybe a mile out. Horse stumbled, went sideways, caught him under when it fell. Took us 20 minutes to get the horse up and get him back on." She moved to Caleb's other side. "Can you walk?" He looked at her. His eyes were focused, but the focusing seemed to cost him something. "I'm walking," he said. His voice had a thick quality to it she didn't like. "You're being carried with dignity," she said. "Different thing. Come on." She and Reeves got him to the kitchen where it was warmest. She pulled a chair close to the stove and they got him into it, and she started working through the ice-stiff layers of his clothing with the focused efficiency of someone who has set aside every feeling she is currently having in order to do what needs doing. His hands were the first thing she checked. Cold, stiff, but color returning already, which was good. His feet next, getting the frozen boots off while Reeves held him steady, because Caleb's attempt to help with this operation was making it harder. She pressed her palm to the soles of his feet in their socks. Cold, but not the dead cold, not the white cold that meant damage. Good. His left side was the problem. Again. The same shoulder that had taken the bruise in November had apparently taken the horse's weight when it went down, and this was more than a bruise. He flinched, actually flinched, involuntarily, the kind that got through even a man who'd decided not to show pain, when she put her hand to it. "Easy," she said. "I'm fine," he said. "You've said that before," she said. "You were wrong then, too." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully decode. Something frustrated. Something else underneath the frustration that wasn't frustration at all. "The men," he started, "are all inside, all moving, all being looked after," she said. "Tom's in the bunkhouse with them. Reeves is here." She glanced up and Reeves gave a short nod that confirmed this. "You're not in charge right now. I am. Drink this." She put a cup of broth in his good hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. He drank it. She went to work on his shoulder the way she'd worked on it in November, with heat and careful pressure, But this was worse than November, and she knew it. The swelling was different. The way he was guarding it was different. "Does it feel like before?" she asked. "No." He said. "Worse?" A pause, which was its own answer. "Reeves," she said without looking up. "In the morning, when the storm allows, I need someone to ride for a doctor. Denton has one." "Harrison," Reeves said. "Old but good." "Morning," Caleb said. "You don't need to—" "I am not asking," she said. She kept her voice level. Not hard, just steady. The particular steadiness she'd developed over months of managing men who didn't know when to stop managing themselves. "You've got something going on in this shoulder that's beyond bruised and beyond my ability to properly assess. And we're going to have a doctor look at it when the storm is clear enough to ride, and until then you're going to sit here and eat something and let it rest. Are we agreed?" He was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. The wind outside pressed against the walls. "Bossy," he said. Not angry, almost quiet. "Yes," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "All right," he said. She got him fed. She got the other men fed. Sent Tom through the kitchen 3 times with the cornbread and the broth, enough that everyone had hot food inside them before the full dark of early evening came down. She checked on the other 5 men who'd been in the north pasture and found them cold and worn and, beyond that, basically fine, which was more than she'd been allowing herself to hope for all afternoon. By the time she got back to the kitchen, Caleb had tilted his head back against the chair and closed his eyes. Rose was in her basket near the stove. The room was warm and quiet, and outside the storm was still going, but with less conviction than it had shown this afternoon. She could hear the difference in the walls, a slightly lower note. She sat down across from him at the kitchen table because her feet had decided they were done, and she looked at him sitting there with his eyes closed and his arm held carefully against his side, and she felt something move through her that she was done pretending was just general human concern. She cared about this man. She had been caring about him for weeks, and had been calling it something else: professional investment, gratitude, pragmatic warmth, and she was tired of the renaming. She cared about him, and he'd come back from that north pasture ice-white and wrong-colored, and it had frightened her in a way that was not professional or pragmatic or anything except personal. She didn't do anything with this information. She just sat with it, the way you sat with things that were too large to immediately act on, and let it be what it was. He opened his eyes, caught her looking at him. She didn't look away. "You're staring," he said. "Checking to make sure you're still conscious," she said. "I'm conscious." "Good." She got up and poured herself some coffee, stood at the stove with it. "Caleb." She'd used his name maybe 3 times in 3 months, and each time it shifted something slightly in the room. He registered it the same way now. A fractional stilling. "Tell me about your son," she said. "If you want to." A long silence. She didn't rush it. "Daniel," he said. He was stubborn. Even at 4, he had opinions about things. What he'd eat, where he'd sit. He had a hat he wouldn't take off indoors, drove his mother crazy." A pause. "He liked the horses. Wasn't afraid of them. That surprised me. Most kids that age are at least a little afraid, and he just walked right up to them like it was obvious that was what you did." She didn't say anything. She just listened. "Clara was—" He stopped. "She was practical, like you. She didn't spend a lot of time on things she couldn't change. She spent a lot of time on things she could." He looked at the fire. "I think that's why it was so bad when she got sick. There wasn't anything practical to do, nothing that could be fixed." "No," Eliza said. "There wasn't." He looked at her. "Your husband, Rose's father." "He wasn't my husband," she said. "He told me he was going to be. He had a different wife already, as it turned out." She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say it, not performing it as a wound, not performing being fine about it, just saying the true thing in the true words. Caleb's jaw tightened. Not at her. She recognized the direction of it. "Did you love him?" he asked. "I thought I did," she said. "I think now I love the version of him that I'd constructed, which isn't the same thing. I was 21 and I wasn't paying close enough attention." "You were 21, he said. "People don't pay close attention at 21. "I do now," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at his coffee cup. "I know," he said, quietly. "I've noticed." The kitchen was very still, just the fire and the wind outside going lower now, and Rose making a small sound in her sleep and then going quiet again. Eliza looked at her hands around her coffee cup and thought about what she was not going to say right now, which was considerable. This was not the moment. He was injured and tired, and they were in the middle of a storm, and the history he just shared with her was still in the air between them, like something that had weight. You didn't walk into a space like that with your own feelings and your own needs. You let it breathe. "You should sleep," she said. "Not in that chair. Go to your room. Shoulders better if I'm upright." "It's not, but I understand the logic." She went to the linen shelf and got a blanket and brought it back and set it in his lap without ceremony. Compromise. He looked at the blanket, then at her. "Eliza," he said. "You're welcome," she said. "Good night." She went to her room before he could say anything else, because she was 22 years old and she had been awake since 4 in the morning, and she had been frightened out of her mind for 6 hours, and she had just sat with her feelings about Caleb Mercer like an adult, and she needed to be alone for approximately 5 minutes before she handled anything else. She sat on the edge of her cot and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Rose was still in this kitchen, in her basket by the stove, which was fine. The kitchen was warm and she'd hear her through the thin wall. But she sat there in the small room alone, and she let herself feel all of it for 1 minute. The fear and the relief and the complicated warmth that had no clean name. And then she lay down and pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. In the morning, the storm had moved east. The sky was that hard blue again, and everything was white and sharp and painfully bright. She got up at 4 as always and went to the kitchen. Caleb was already up. He was at the window with his coffee, looking out at the north. The blanket was folded on the chair. She went to the stove without saying anything and started the fire up and put water on for more coffee. Reached for the flour. "I heard Daniel's voice once," he said, without turning from the window. "About a year after. I was out by the creek, and I heard him call out like he used to when he wanted me to look at something. I stopped and stood there for probably 5 minutes before I could make myself walk again." She kept her hands in the flour, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "My mother," she said finally. 6 months after she passed. She said my name in the middle of a grocery store in St. Louis. Someone else's voice, completely different if I'd thought about it for a second. I dropped a jar of molasses. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had laugh in its structure. "Grief's strange," she said, "the way it hides and then finds you." "Yeah," he said. He turned from the window and looked at her across the kitchen. Early morning, both of them in the particular honest state of people who haven't had enough sleep and are too tired to put up the usual structures. "Yeah, it is." She held his look for just a second. Then she went back to the biscuits, and he went to get dressed for the day. And outside, the bright cold world of January waited for both of them with its usual indifference and its usual demand. Keep going. Just keep going. She kept going. It was the only thing she'd ever really known how to do. Dr. Harrison came out from Denton 2 days after the January storm. A small, precise man in his late 60s who smelled like pipe tobacco and moved through the ranch house with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing difficult things in difficult places for a long time. He examined Caleb's shoulder in the kitchen while Eliza made coffee and tried not to obviously listen, which she failed at entirely. "Partial separation," Harrison said, with the same tone a carpenter might use to identify a warped board. "You've had something going on in this joint before." "November," Caleb said. "Should have rested it in November." "I had a ranch to run." "You've still got a ranch to run," Harrison said. "And if you use this shoulder the way you've been using it for the next 3 weeks, you'll have a ranch to run with one functional arm for the rest of your life. Your choice." A silence that Eliza could feel from across the kitchen. 3 weeks, Caleb repeated. "Minimum. And I mean rest. Not your version of rest, which I suspect involves doing everything you normally do but slightly slower." She kept her eyes on the coffee pot. She did not smile, though it required some effort. Harrison wrapped the shoulder with a competence that made it look easy, gave instructions that Eliza listened to carefully because she was the one who would actually be enforcing them, and accepted coffee and cornbread before making the ride back to Denton. At the door, he paused and looked at her with the direct, assessing look of a man who had spent decades reading situations quickly. "You the cook?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He looked at Rose on her hip, looked back at Eliza. "Good cornbread," he he said, and left. The 3 weeks that followed were, in their own way, harder than any of the storms. Not because Caleb was a bad patient. He wasn't, exactly. He was a patient who found the state of being a patient fundamentally offensive and addressed this by finding things he could do one-handed and doing them with a focused intensity that made everyone around him tired just to watch. He mended harnesses. He did the account books. He repaired a section of fence near the barn using a method that Reeves watched with the pained expression of a man who wanted to offer help and knew it wouldn't be accepted. But he stayed out of the heavy work. He stayed off horses, which cost him something. She could see it in the mornings when he stood at the barn door and watched the men ride out. A look on his face that was a complex mixture of things she'd gotten better at reading over the months. And he was home more. Present in the main house in a way he hadn't been before, because there were only so many hours a man could spend on accounts and harness repair. Which meant he was in the kitchen more. Not interfering, not even really talking, most of the time. He would come in for coffee and then not leave, sitting at the table with whatever he was working on, and she would cook around him the way she cooked around everything. Efficiently, without fuss, adapting to the presence the way the kitchen had adapted to her. Rose found this arrangement entirely satisfactory. She had entered a phase of focused, determined attempts at motion. Not quite crawling yet, but practicing the prerequisites with great seriousness, pushing up on her arms, and then being outraged when her legs didn't follow. And Caleb would watch her from the table with that expression Eliza had first seen the morning Rose grabbed his hand. Open, unguarded. A face she suspected very few people had ever seen. One afternoon she turned from the stove and found him on the floor. Not fallen, sitting, cross-legged on the kitchen floor, which was an undignified position for a rancher in his own house, watching Rose attempt her push-up routine from approximately 18 inches away. Rose was delighted by this development. She made her conversational sound at him, the one that meant she was directing information at a specific recipient. "She's talking to you," Eliza said. "I noticed," he said. He didn't move. "What does she want?" "I think she wants you to appreciate her progress." He looked at Rose solemnly. "I see it," he told her. Rose made another sound and pushed up on her arms with great effort, and then collapsed, and he put out a hand instinctively to keep her from bumping her face on the floor. She didn't need it. She landed fine, but his hand hovered there for a second after, not quite touching. Eliza turned back to the stove. These were the moments she didn't know what to do with, and there were more of them as February wore on. Small things. The way he'd started noticing when the wood box in her room was getting low before she mentioned it. The way she'd started making a second cup of coffee without being asked whenever she heard him coming in from the barn. Neither of them pointed any of it out. It was just the texture of the days, slowly changing, the way the quality of light changed in February. Subtle enough that you couldn't point to a single day and say there. That's when it shifted, but undeniable if you compared where you were to where you'd been 2 months ago. Dolan saw it. She knew he did, because Dolan watched everything with the comprehensive attention of a man who had spent his life on ranges where missing a detail could get you hurt. He didn't say anything to Eliza about it, but one morning he came into the kitchen when Caleb was at the table, and there was some exchange between the two men. Short, practical, about something to do with the cattle count. And when Caleb left, Dolan poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and said without looking at her, "He's a good man." She kept stirring. "I know," she said. "Had a rough go of it," Dolan said. "I know that too." A pause. She could feel him choosing his next words with more care than he usually applied to words. He's not a man who says things," Dolan said. "He does them. You have to watch what he does, not wait for what he says, because the saying doesn't always come." She stopped stirring, looked at the side of Dolan's face. He was looking at the wall. "Walter," she said. He looked at her then, startled enough by the use of his given name that his usual guard dropped for a second. "Thank you," she said. He put his coffee cup in the basin and walked out. The cradle appeared in the first week of March. She came into the kitchen one morning, and it was there, sitting beside the work table where Rose's basket usually lived. A wooden cradle, hand-built, with curved runners and sides that had been sanded until they were smooth as finished furniture. Not rough ranch work. The joinery at the corners was careful and precise. Each piece fitted clean. Someone had spent time on this. Real time, working with the kind of focused attention that didn't happen in a spare 20 minutes between jobs. She stood looking at it for a long moment. She knew when he'd done it. The late evenings, the sounds she'd been hearing from the small workshop beside the barn. Sounds she'd assumed were maintenance work, equipment repair. The smell of fresh wood shavings she'd caught sometimes when she went out to check the cold pantry at night. She'd registered these things in the background, the way you register details that hadn't assembled themselves into meaning yet. They had assembled themselves now. She picked up Rose from the floor where she'd set her and held her against her chest and stood there looking at that cradle with the particular feeling of someone who has been bracing for a long time and has just realized very suddenly that the thing they were bracing against has changed character entirely. She heard boots on the porch. She turned around and Caleb came through the back door and he saw her standing there with Rose and his cradle in the middle of the kitchen floor, and he stopped. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She watched him take stock of her face and saw him doing what he always did, looking for information, reading the situation, deciding what to do with what he found. "It's not finished," he said. "I need to put a coat of oil on the wood still, but I thought—" He stopped. "The basket's getting small for her." "The basket's fine," she said. "She's going to outgrow it soon." "Caleb." He went quiet. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen." He looked at the cradle, then at her, then at some point between them. She watched the back of his neck go slightly red, which on a man who had ridden out into January storms without visible distress was remarkable. "It's just a cradle," he said. "It's not," she said. He looked at her then, straight on, and there it was. That thing she'd been seeing in pieces for months, the open face, the unguarded version of him, and this time it didn't last 10 seconds, and then close. It stayed. "No," he said. "It's not." Rose, with her characteristic timing, chose this moment to grab a fistful of Eliza's collar and make her most authoritative conversational sound, which broke the particular tension in the room enough for both of them to breathe. Eliza laughed. Not a polite laugh. A real one, slightly helpless, the kind that came from being caught off guard by relief. Caleb made that almost smile, the one she'd been cataloging since November, and then he bent down and tested the cradle's runners on the floor, rocking it once to check the weight distribution, and she watched him and thought, "This man built a cradle for my daughter." She was still holding that thought when he straightened up and said, "I'll oil it tonight," and went back out to the barn. She stood in the kitchen for another minute before she trusted her legs to carry her to the stove. The days that followed had a different quality. Not easier, exactly. The ranch work didn't ease in March, with calving beginning and the mud season arriving to make every task twice as hard as it had been in the frozen simplicity of January. But something between her and Caleb had reached a new arrangement, a new proximity, and they were both navigating it with the careful attention of people who understood that what they were carrying was worth not dropping. He started eating differently. Or rather, he started actually eating, the way she'd been trying to feed him for months, with attention and something approaching enjoyment rather than the fueling the machine quality he'd brought to meals in November. She noticed it without pointing it out. She noticed everything without pointing it out. That was still how it worked between them. But small things changed. He stopped leaving the room when she was in it, which he'd done, she realized now, for most of the winter. Always having somewhere else to be. Always remembering something in the barn or the study when they'd been alone in the same space for more than a few minutes. Now he stayed. He'd sit at the table with his coffee, and she'd be at the stove and they'd talk. Actually talk. Not just exchange information about ranch logistics, but talk the way she'd been talking with him in the bad moments. The January storm morning, Christmas Eve. Except it wasn't a bad moment. It was just an ordinary morning, and they were just talking. He told her about this ranch's early years, when he'd built the barn with 3 men and inadequate lumber and a stubbornness that had compensated, barely, for the lack of resources. She told him about the Harvey house, the discipline of it, the satisfaction of a kitchen that ran exactly right. He told her Daniel had been born in the main bedroom upstairs, in a blizzard, which meant there'd been no doctor, and he'd had to manage with Claire's instructions and his own terror. She told him her mother had delivered her own youngest sibling on a kitchen floor in Ohio and had gone back to making bread within the hour, which was a family story they'd always told as evidence of something admirable, but which she'd reconsidered since having Rose. What were you afraid of? He asked once. When you came here, what were you most afraid of? She thought about it honestly. That you'd send me away and I'd have nowhere left to go, she said. And then that you wouldn't, and I'd start to... She stopped. Start to what? He said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the steady patience of a man who had decided to wait as long as necessary. Need it, she said. This? The job? The ranch? A pause. The people. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a bad thing? It is if it goes away, she said. He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. She'd watched him do that for 4 months. That small turning motion when he was deciding something. It's not going away, he said. She held his look. You don't know that, she said. You can't know that. No, he said, but I know what I'm deciding, and I'm deciding it's not going away. She looked at him for a long time. Caleb, she said. I know, he said. I know it's not... He stopped, tried again. I'm not saying it right. You're saying it fine, she said. I just need you to be sure. I've been sure since December, he said. I've been trying to figure out if you... He stopped again. He was not a man who struggled for words usually. The struggling was somehow more honest than ease would have been. I have been, she said quietly. Since before December. He looked at her. Something settled in his face, something that had been held with effort coming down. Rose, in her new cradle by the stove, made the conversational sound. They both looked at her. She had apparently strong feelings about something on the ceiling. She has opinions, Caleb said. She always has, Eliza said. He looked from Rose to Eliza with the open face, the one she'd first seen that morning he crouched on the kitchen floor, and she thought, this is what it looks like when a man who has been alone a long time realizes he's not alone anymore. Not happiness exactly. Bigger than that. Something more like the feeling of a held breath finally let out. I should get back, he said. Calves. I know, she said. He stood up. He put his coat on, right side first because the shoulders still gave him trouble, and she watched him do it without offering to help because she knew he didn't want help with it. He got to the door and he stopped and he turned around. Thank you, he said, for all of it, all winter. You hired me, she said. I tried to send you away, he said, and you stayed anyway. She smiled. A real one, not the managed kind. The storm helped. Yeah, he said. It did. And he looked at her with that look, the final version of it, the one she now understood was the only face he had that told the complete truth. Then he went out the door. She stood in the kitchen with her hand on the side of the cradle, rocking it gently. Rose had gone back to sleep with the sudden, total unconsciousness of someone who had concluded that the ceiling held no further interest. Outside, she could hear Caleb crossing the yard toward the barn, boot steps in the March mud. She could hear the cattle in the distance, the low continuous sound of the herd. She could hear the wind, which in March was different from January's wind, less like a threat, more like a reminder. Still here. Still going. She thought about the $8.40 she'd had in her coat pocket the day she'd knocked on this door. She thought about the snow coming down outside while she'd made stew for 14 men she didn't know, trying to prove in a single evening that she had a right to a roof. She thought about how long a winter was and how much could change inside one. Then she turned back to the stove, and she started thinking about what to make for supper. Something good, something worth coming in for at the end of a hard March day. Because that was still her job and she was still good at it, and some things hadn't changed at all, which was its own kind of comfort. March mud gave way to April mud, which was somehow worse, deeper, more persistent, the kind that pulled at boot heels with a sucking determination and worked its way into everything. The barn, the porch, the kitchen floor that Eliza swept twice a day and still found tracked with the dark Montana earth by evening. She had stopped being bothered by it somewhere around the 3rd week of April. The mud was just part of the place now, part of what it meant to live here. And she had crossed some line, quietly and without ceremony, where here had stopped being a temporary arrangement and started being simply where she was. She hadn't said this out loud to anyone. She didn't need to. The ranch had its own way of knowing things. The calving season ran through March into April's first 2 weeks, and during that period Caleb was present in the particular way of someone who is both physically there and somewhere else entirely. focused on the herd with the total attention that the season demanded, sleeping in broken intervals, appearing in the kitchen at odd hours for coffee and food, and occasionally sitting down for long enough that she could see the exhaustion in him before he pulled himself back upright and went out again. She kept food available at all hours. She didn't ask how it was going because she could read how it was going from his face when he came in, and she understood by now that asking him to report on problems he was already solving was not useful. What was useful was hot food and coffee and a kitchen that was warm and didn't require anything from him for 15 minutes. She did that. She was good at that. Tom Briggs lost a calf in the second week and took it hard in the way that young men took these things when they hadn't yet built the particular callus that ranch work built over time. Not indifferent, exactly, but able to hold the loss without it reaching all the way through. He sat at the kitchen table after supper and didn't say much, and she put a plate of extra biscuits in front of him and sat across from him with her coffee and didn't say much either. And after a while he said, "I keep thinking I could have gotten there faster." And she said, "Maybe. Or maybe it was already too late when you got there, and you'll never know which. And either way, you did what you could." And he nodded and ate a biscuit, and that was that. These were the things she'd gotten good at, she realized. Not just the cooking, she'd always been good at that, but the other things. Reading what people needed and providing it without making them ask. Managing the temperature of a room, not the literal temperature, but the emotional one, the way a place felt to the people in it. She hadn't known she was good at it before, because she'd never had a place where she could practice it consistently, where people stayed and the relationships had time to develop a shape. She thought about this on a morning in late April, standing at the kitchen window watching the mountains. The snow line had moved up the slopes over the past weeks, retreating toward the peaks, and the lower slopes were showing the first pale green of new grass. Below that, the ranch yard with its familiar geometry, barn, bunkhouse, outbuildings, the fence line running south. She knew this view from months of standing at this window, knew it well enough that any change in it registered immediately. What she was thinking about was the $8.40. She had 3 months of wages saved now, more than she'd ever had at one time in her adult life, more than enough to get somewhere with Rose and start over, which had been the plan when she arrived. Earn enough to have options, to not be running on nothing toward the next place and the next. She had that now. She had the option. She wasn't thinking about leaving. She was thinking about the fact that she wasn't thinking about leaving, and what that meant about how much had changed since November. Caleb found her like that, standing at the window with her coffee, thinking, when he came in from the early barn check. He went to the stove, poured his own coffee, and came to stand beside her at the window. Not close enough to be deliberate about it, but close enough that she was aware of him, the particular warmth of another person standing near. They looked out at the yard together. "Grass is coming," he said. "I noticed," she said. "A few more weeks, we start moving the herd to the high pasture." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Roundup's in June. It'll get loud around here. More men, longer days." "I can handle loud," she said. "I know you can." A pause. I'm telling you what's coming, so you know." She looked at the side of his face. "Caleb." He looked at her. "I know what's coming," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Something in him let go. She could see it. Not a dramatic release, just a small settling, the way a rope went slightly slack when the tension on the other end eased. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He looked back out the window. She watched him decide how to say whatever he was deciding to say, and she didn't rush it because she had learned over the whole of a Montana winter that this man's words came out better when they weren't rushed. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this right," he said. I'm not good at the saying part. I know that. I know I've left you to do a lot of the figuring out of things that I should have said out loud." He paused. "I'm sorry for that." She hadn't expected the apology. It caught her somewhere behind the sternum. "You don't have to," she started. "I do," he said. "Claire used to tell me that not saying things was its own kind of thing, that it wasn't neutral, that people couldn't read my head and I had to use words sometimes even when it felt unnecessary." He looked at her. She was right. She usually was. "She sounds like she was," Eliza said. "I don't want to do that again," he said. "Leave things unsaid until it's too late to say them." He set his coffee cup on the windowsill and turned to face her fully. "So I'm going to say this, even though I'm going to do it badly. She waited. You came here with nothing, and you made this place into something I don't recognize anymore, he said. Not the buildings or the work, that's the same, but the inside of it, the way it feels to be here. I forgot what it felt like to live somewhere instead of just working somewhere, and you reminded me. He stopped, shook his head slightly. That's not what I mean to say. What I mean is, I don't want you here because of the cooking. I want you here because it's you and Rose. And I'd like, if you're willing, for that to be a permanent arrangement. The kitchen was very still. Permanent, she said. I'm asking you to marry me, he said. I know that's... He made a short gesture that seemed to encompass the inadequacy of the moment, the lack of a ring, the setting of a ranch kitchen with muddy boots by the door and a baby in a handmade cradle by the stove. I know this isn't... I should probably have planned this better. You built her a cradle, Eliza said. He blinked. What? You built Rose a cradle, she said. Out of wood you cut and sanded yourself, in the evenings, while your shoulder was still healing. You got on the floor of this kitchen and talked to her. You sent Dolan away when he made a remark, the first week I was here, when you didn't even know us yet. She paused. You don't need to plan better. You've been asking me for months. I've just been waiting for the part where you said it in words. He looked at her for a long moment. Is that a yes? Yes, she said. That's a yes. He stood there for a second with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not the open face, not the unguarded face, but something past both of those. Something that was simply and without complication relieved. Like a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. Then Rose made her sound, the conversational one, directing remarks at the ceiling, and Caleb laughed. A real one. Not the short, almost laugh she'd been cataloging since November, but a full one. Warm and slightly unpracticed, the laugh of a man who'd forgotten he had it. Eliza started laughing too, slightly helplessly, and they stood there in the kitchen laughing at her daughter's ceiling commentary until the laughter ran its course, and then Caleb reached out and tucked a piece of her hair back from her face, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who had wanted to do that for a long time, and had decided to stop not doing it. She went still at the touch. Then she turned her face slightly into his hand, briefly, before stepping back and picking up her coffee because she had breakfast to start, and she was not a woman who fell apart in kitchens. I have to make biscuits, she said. I know, he said. He was still smiling, that unfamiliar, good version of his face. He picked up his coffee and went back to his usual spot at the table, and she went to the flour barrel, and the morning continued. It was not, she thought, the most romantic proposal in the history of proposals, but it was an honest one, between two people who understood what it meant to lose things and were therefore taking nothing for granted, and that seemed worth more than romance. They told the men at supper, or rather, Caleb told them, at the end of the meal, in the same direct way he announced anything, without preamble, without performance. Eliza's agreed to marry me, he said. I expect you'll all behave accordingly. There was a pause. Tom Briggs let out a sound that might have been a whoop if he'd followed through on it, which he didn't, though his face made all the moves. Reeves looked at his plate and nodded once with the expression of a man who had been expecting this and was satisfied to be proven right. Two of the younger hands exchanged a look that suggested this had been the subject of at least one bunkhouse conversation. Dolan, at the far end of the table, was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Eliza with the direct, assessing look she'd come to understand was his version of openness. "'Bout time,' he said. It was, coming from Walt Dolan, a substantial speech. "'Thank you, Walter,' she said. He picked up his coffee and didn't say anything else. But there was something different about his face, a loosening of something that had been held tightly for a long time, the particular relief of a man who has been watching over something and can finally stand down. The wedding was 3 weeks later, small and practical, the way everything on the ranch was small and practical. The minister came out from Denton on a Saturday in early May, a young man who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the landscape and recovered by focusing on the ceremony with nervous precision. They stood on the porch of the main house in the morning light, Eliza in her best dress, which was not a wedding dress but was clean and fit properly, Caleb in the only suit he owned which had seen better decades but was pressed and respectable. Reeves stood up for Caleb. Tom Briggs held Rose, who was deeply interested in his hat, and made several attempts on it during the ceremony, which disrupted the solemnity somewhat and improved everything else. Dolan stood on the porch steps and watched with his arms crossed. She caught his face at one point, between the words, and saw something there that surprised her. Not sentimentality, which would have been out of character, but something close to it. A man who had loved his own wife, 8 years gone, and was watching something that reminded him of what that was, and was allowing himself to be reminded rather than turning away from it. She made a small note of it, added it to everything she'd learned about him since November. The minister said the words. Caleb said yes in the flat, sure tone of a man who had made up his mind and had no need to perform certainty because the certainty was simply there. Eliza said yes in her own voice, steady, looking at him directly the way she'd looked at him across countless kitchen moments and difficult mornings, and the particular intimacy of two people who have been through something hard together and come through on the same side. Then it was done. They were married. Tom Briggs cheered. Rose grabbed his hat. Dolan uncrossed his arms. There was food afterward. Of course there was, because Eliza had made sure of it, spending 2 days on the preparations. And the men ate and talked in the way they did at their best, easy and warm, the bunkhouse culture fully present in the May afternoon sun. Somebody had found a bottle of whiskey, and it went around. Reeves made a toast that was 3 words long. Good for you. It was entirely sufficient. Eliza stood on the porch at some point in the middle of the afternoon, away from the noise for a moment, looking out at the mountains. The snow line was higher now, the peaks still white but the slopes below green and opening up, the whole landscape doing what it did in spring, becoming more than it had been, becoming what it had always been waiting to become under the winter. She thought about the woman who had climbed down from Pete Galloway's wagon 6 months ago with a baby in a leather trunk and $8.40, and the particular determination of someone with no remaining options. She thought about how that woman had knocked on a stranger's door in the dying November light and been told to leave and stayed anyway, because there was nowhere left to go. She thought about how necessity had turned into something else, gradually and without announcing itself, the way most real things happened. She didn't believe in the version of this story where everything happened for a reason, where the universe had engineered her circumstances to deliver her here. That was a comfortable story, and she had lived too close to the uncomfortable ones to trust it. What she believed was simpler and, she thought, more true. That she had kept moving, and Caleb had kept working, and they had both done the daily difficult thing for long enough that something had built up between them, the way sediment built up, layer by layer, until it was solid enough to stand on. That was what they had. Not destiny. Something you built. She heard the door behind her and felt him come to stand beside her. She knew his presence now the way you knew a sound you'd been hearing every day, without having to look. "You're quiet," he said. "Thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered it. "About how I almost didn't come here," she said. "I had 2 other advertisements. A hotel in Wyoming, a family in Idaho. I almost took the hotel." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you?" "Montana sounded far enough," she said. "From everything I was leaving." She looked at him. "I didn't know far enough would turn out to mean far enough to start over completely." He looked out at the mountains. "I almost wrote a different advertisement," he said. "I almost said family welcome. I didn't because I thought it would complicate things." She laughed. "It did complicate things." "Yeah," he said. He looked at her with the open face, the final version, the one that was just his face when he wasn't holding it back. It complicated things in every possible direction. She reached out and took his hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, taking another hand, the simplest possible thing. He closed his fingers around hers, and they stood there looking at the mountains. Rose's voice came from inside. Not crying, the conversational sound, directed at Tom Briggs or the ceiling or both. And Eliza felt Caleb's hand tighten slightly around hers at the sound. That small, involuntary response. And she thought, there it is. That was the thing she'd been watching build since the morning he crouched on the kitchen floor. That was what a man's heart looked like when it came back open after a long time closed. Not smooth, not without scars, just open, functional, capable again. She'd watched him come back to himself the same way she'd watched the mountains come back in spring. Not a single event, just accumulation, just persistence, until one day the thing you'd been waiting to see was simply there. She knew something about that. She'd done it herself. They went back inside together, into the warm noise of it, the men talking, and Rose presiding over the afternoon from Tom Briggs's arms with the authority she'd been developing since birth. Caleb let go of her hand at the door, not pulling away, just both of them moving back into the ordinary motion of the day, which was its own kind of comfort, the fact that this was simply now how ordinary days would be. Dolan caught her eye across the room. He raised his coffee cup slightly. It was, from him, a toast. She raised hers back. That evening, after the men had gone and the food had been cleared and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Caleb built up the fire in the front room, a room she'd rarely been in, more formal than the kitchen, with 2 chairs and a window looking west. And she brought Rose and sat in one of the chairs, and he sat in the other, and they didn't talk about anything in particular. She fed Rose. He looked at the fire. The mountains outside the window were going dark and pink in the last light. It was not a perfect evening. Her feet hurt. The fabric of her best dress was scratchy at the collar, and she'd been wanting to change out of it for hours. Caleb had a tension in his jaw that meant he was already thinking about tomorrow's work, the herd, the 60 things that needed doing before the roundup. Rose was tired and therefore difficult, flirting with sleep and then pulling back from it with the infuriating indecision of an overtired infant. None of that was a problem. None of that was in the way of anything. This was the thing she had learned over 6 months of days that were hard and cold and longer than they should have been, the thing she hadn't known she was learning until she looked back and saw it clearly, that real life, the livable kind, the kind worth having, was not the version without difficulty. It was the version where the difficulty was shared, where you came in from the cold to a warm kitchen and someone had kept the stove going, where you held a compress to a man's hurt shoulder and he ate his soup left-handed without complaining, where a cradle appeared one morning, built in secret, from wood sanded smooth in the evenings by a man who didn't say things but did them, where a door that had been shut for 7 years opened, slowly, over the course of a single winter. Rose finally gave in to sleep, her small face going soft and blank with the total surrender of an infant who has decided all arguments are concluded. Eliza held her and looked at the fire and listened to the quiet. "Caleb," she said. "We're going to be all right," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement either. It was a thing she was saying out loud because some truths needed to be said in words, even between people who had gotten good at saying things without them. He looked at her across the fire. His face in the firelight was the honest version, the one she'd been given gradually, in pieces, over 6 months of difficult and ordinary days. "Yeah," he said, "we are." Outside, the May night settled over the ranch, over the barn and the bunkhouse and the fence lines running south, over the pastures where the herd moved in the dark, over the mountains with their retreating snow. The frontier was still there, still indifferent, still demanding. It would ask hard things of them tomorrow and the day after that. The work didn't stop. The cold would come back. The distance between this ranch and the rest of the world was still the same considerable distance it had always been. But inside the fire was warm, and Rose was asleep, and 2 people who had each come to the end of their respective ropes had, by some combination of stubbornness and necessity and the slowly accumulated weight of small daily kindnesses, built something neither of them had been looking for. Not a perfect life, not a story without cost, just a home, in the one place neither of them had expected to find it, built by 2 people imperfect enough to need it and determined enough to make it last. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.